Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Stock versus overclocked 3.5 gigahertz versus 4.5 gigahertz on a 10-year-old CPU. Does overclocking really help? This is a revisit of the i7-980X 6-core 12-thread CPU. I just got done covering this, comparing it to the 4-core 8-thread version, the i7-920. But we don't have the i7-920 here. Instead, we are looking at stock versus overclocked, which in this particular case is 3.5 versus 4.5 gigahertz. I thought about slowing it down to try to simulate the 2.66 gigahertz speed of the i7-920. I briefly thought about putting the i7-920 back in, and I'm like, yeah, no, there's no point to that. In 2020, if you're running an i7-920 at stock speeds, yes, you should either overclock it or upgrade it. So we're taking a look at two different clock speeds in the same basic configuration, and we're in the same basic area of the game. Now, it's not the exact same mission like it was before. That mission is complete, and undoing it and redoing it is kind of difficult. So I am in the same general area, but it is in fact not the same mission. So it's not quite as comparable as the previous video, but it's pretty close. Now, this is not base clock overclocking. If you have one of the $30 Xeon X5675 CPUs, then you'll need to set your base clock to 190, 195, or 200, depending upon your overclocking success, because you can't adjust the multiplier. In the i7-980X's point, I can simply increase the multiplier to 34, and then I don't have to care. It runs perfectly. Taking a look at the CPU numbers on MSI Afterburner, you can see right there we're running at about 3.5 gigahertz on the left and about 4.5 gigahertz on the right. This does provide additional performance, but it does not provide as much performance as you might think, and we are CPU bound. This is an important point because if we were graphics card bound, if we had a GTX 770 in here or a GTX 960, then of course there'd be no difference because the graphics card would be a complete bottleneck. We have an RTX 2080 Ti, which is way overkill. Please do not put a 2080 Ti in a 10-year-old system. That's a waste of money. You should upgrade first, put in something more modest. But the point here is to uplift the graphics performance enough so that we're only looking at the difference of the CPU, not the difference of the graphics card. Furthermore, allow me to point out that the RAM speed reported on the screen is wrong on both of these. It is not 1333, it's 1600. Why I typed that into MSI Afterburner, I don't know. Habit, perhaps. But that is simply just a typo on my part. It really is DDR3 1600 on both sides. If you look at the graphics card usage, you will notice a trend. Of course, there's no line or average given for usage in MSI Afterburner, which would be really cool to have that over time, but there isn't. But if you look at the graphics card usage, you'll notice that it's higher. And it's going to be consistently higher throughout this run. I mean, I can, of course, make this a 3-minute video, but the point is to give you a chance to watch enough of the footage to get some comparables, because if you just watch 30 seconds or 60 seconds of footage, you may or may not be seeing the whole picture. So I'm showing this to you largely uncut, not the entire thing, because that would take over 20 minutes as I run around and cause general mayhem, but I'm showing you enough that you can watch it over time and see what to expect. And we are, of course, using more on the right-hand side. And the frame rate is higher. If you look at the right-hand side of the screen, we are getting, on average, higher frame rates. But is it substantially higher frame rates? Well, in this particular scene, in this scenario, what I'm doing right here, in fact, you actually see it's higher on the left because I was bending down to pick somebody up and run with them. But again, that's area of the game. You have to go with trends and averages and see the performance over time. Right now, we have a running average of 86 frames per second on the 4.5 gigahertz overclock and 82 frames per second on the stock 3.5. It's the middle white number is the rolling average. The second to right number is the rolling 1% low, and the far right white number is the rolling average 0.1% low. Then you can see the frame times in milliseconds and then the real-time frame rates on the left on those numbers. I think it's kind of interesting and informative to be able to watch these develop in real time. You'll notice that towards the beginning of this, they changed more. But here they're not changing as much because they kind of settle into a routine. A blurp in frames, a stutter is certainly going to cause a momentary movement, especially on the 0.1% low side. But as I just run around and shoot things and snipe things and get a mission and pick up stuff, and well, there I'm running very fast on the left, it doesn't change very much. It really doesn't move very much. Now, you cannot take these results and necessarily correlate them to brand new CPUs. And I would do this test on brand new CPUs, except the current generation of modern CPUs doesn't have any overclocking in them, frankly, worth caring about. Yes, you can take an i9 9900K and overclock it to 5 gigahertz. In fact, virtually all of my i9 9900K benchmarks are at 5 gigahertz. But what that ignores is that the stock all-core boost speed, so long as you have anything remotely approaching decent cooling, is 4.7. But wait, you say, the base speed is 3.6. How can that be? Base clock speeds don't mean anything. Base clock speeds really don't mean anything. It's the boost speed that matters. And on the Intel side, 4.7 on an i9 9900K is what you're going to get stuck. An i7 8700K is 4.3 gigahertz all core. So that overclock to 5 makes a small difference, but not a huge one. An i7 7700K has a 4.2 gigahertz all-core boost. And in fact, that's what my son's runs at. We upgraded my son's old CyberPower PC from 2016. It has a very cheap MSI B150 Bazooka motherboard. We updated the BIOS. We replaced his 6th generation i5 4-core 4-thread chip with a 7th generation i7 7700K CPU, 4.2 gigahertz, all cores, in basically any situation. It has a Hyper 212 EVO 1. It runs cool and quiet, no issues whatsoever. It's very nice, actually, all things considered, except for the fact that the CPU itself is worth a lot of money and it was way too expensive. Interestingly enough, the biggest difference from the overclock to 3.5 to 4.5 isn't in a frame rate chart that I can show you. It's in the launch speed of the game. It's in the update speed of the game. It's in the multitasking performance of the machine. There's a variety of things that tend to be CPU heavy that do make a difference when you make a 1 gigahertz overclock, but rarely is it directly frame rates. I mean, it can be, but in this particular case, it's a minor difference in frame rates. The real difference is in the overall performance of the machine. Of course, it's still slow by modern standards, and this is also where frame rate charts are, shall we say, deceptive to say the least. If you look at these numbers, you'd be very tempted to say, well, if I have a modest graphics card like a GTX 1070 for the sake of discussion, and a 1070 is still fine for 1440p gaming, which is remarkable, and if you want to play this at 1440p at about this frame rate with a 1070, you might say, wow, so I can get myself an i7 980X, or I can get myself a Xeon X5675 and base clock overclock it, and there's just no need for a new computer. 10-year-old computers rock. There's no reason whatsoever to buy a current modern computer. And I'd say, well, that's just a nice thing to say that's completely and totally and horrifically awfully wrong. But the frame rates, well, frame rates aren't everything. Frame rates are nice, but that's like saying a Dodge Hellcat is the equivalent of a Ferrari or a Lamborghini just because it has great 0 to 60 time and has a lot of horsepower under the hood. The thing weighs 4,000 pounds and handles like a dog. If you take it on the track and and actually try to maneuver it around a track, the thing just wallows all over the place. It's a terrible track car. It's a great drag car because it's a muscle car, but it's a terrible sports car and it's a terrible track car because it weighs 4,000 pounds. But it does have lots of power and it goes in a straight line very, very fast. Classic muscle car. So in this case, yes, a 10-year-old CPU provides perfectly adequate frame rates with a modest mid-range graphics card, no problem. But the overall computing experience, booting Windows, opening web browsers, clicking on links, having YouTube open and play back a video, switching between programs, running Windows updates, running game updates, installing things. It's not in any chart. But if you sit down in front of this computer And then you go sit down in front of, let's be fair, an i7 8700K, which is a 6-core 12-thread Intel CPU, or a Ryzen 5 3600X, which is also 6-core 12-thread. No one in their right mind who's remotely paying attention would call them the same thing, even though the frame rates would not be as dramatically different as you would expect them to be. But the real-world use of them is, how do you show that in a YouTube video? That's always the challenge, isn't it? Because a lot of it is feeling, speed, perception, clicking, typing, moving between apps, moving between programs, and it's not necessarily peak frame rate, although the frame rate will be a little bit higher and everything's a little bit nicer. As a bonus, I'm going to show you footage of a Ryzen 7 2700X, not even the 3700X, a 2700X playing at 1440p, high detail in Ghost Recon Breakpoint here in just a minute after I show you the chart for this. And as a further bonus, it is not running an RTX 2080 Ti, it's running an RTX 2080, a stock 2080, not a super, which I realize is a different video card, but for the purposes of this, you might be surprised. I'm going to show you that here in just a minute. Something to keep in mind whenever you overclock any component, you're only overclocking that one component in general. Making the CPU 1 gigahertz faster does not make the QPI link any faster. It does not make the DDR3 any faster. It does not make the PCI Express 2.0 bus any faster, which is of course also holding back our graphics card. It doesn't make anything else in the computer faster except that one thing. Now, if that one thing was what was holding back your performance, then your computer will be faster. But if that one thing wasn't, then you're not going to see a big change in performance. You're only going to see an improvement if you improve the performance of whatever was holding you back from going faster. In total, across all the gameplay that I did, there was 2 frames per second difference between stock and overclocked. 2. And it's 2 in the average, and 2 in the 1% low, and 4 in the 0.1% low. Now, for sure, there's obviously times during that live gameplay where there was a larger difference because I was doing different things, and that's just going to happen. But I showed you 10 minutes of, actually more than 10 minutes of footage so that you can get an idea of it and kind of scroll through it and see what to expect. Overclocking's nice, but Intel really reached the peak of this platform at the 3.5 gigahertz clock speed, and that's probably why we never got more speed even though it was capable of it, because it doesn't really do anything. I mean, it's nicer, but it's not the improvement that you would think a 1 gigahertz boost should be. Now, as a bonus, here is footage from the Ryzen 7 2700X running at stock clock speeds. Now, we have DDR4 3000, not 3200, and we are running an RTX 2080, not a 2080 Ti, and this is not a super, by the way. This is a launch card. And you can already tell that the performance is much better. Now, we're flying in a helicopter here for sure at the moment, but I'm about to assault this airfield up ahead here, and I land on the roof, and I snipe some of the enemy. I end up taking off in the helicopter again. I fly to the southern end of the runway. I land, I assault the control tower, and I actually take over the entire base. This entire benchmark run was actually just over 23 minutes long, taking over the airfield, the airstrip here, and then the building and killing all of the enemies. I'm going to show you a bonus chart here in a second to show you the difference between a 10-year-old CPU overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz and a modern budget Ryzen 7 2700X with a less expensive graphics card. Here's a thought. If you have an older machine and you put all your money in your graphics card, a 2080 Ti will run you about $1,000, maybe a little bit more if you buy a premium model. Whereas if you buy a 2080, 2080s can be had in the $600 price range these days. Frankly, a 2070 Super is pretty close. And then a Ryzen 7 2700X plus a motherboard will run you about $250, give or take. And then another $65 for 16 gigabytes of RAM. So it is less expensive to buy a new CPU, a new motherboard, and new RAM, and an RTX 2080 than it is to buy a 2080 Ti, which says as much about how much NVIDIA is charging for 2080 Ti's, but we won't go there for this video. So is this use of your money more effective than just buying the best video card in the world and keeping your old machine? Because, hey, those old computers are great, aren't they? Well, we're over 100 frames per second here. And our 1% low is higher, and our 0.1% low is higher, and we're on a modern platform. And let me just tell you from experience, everything's just a bit nicer on a modern platform. And we have better security, because those old Intel chips sure have a lot of security flaws still built in them. Now, for those of you curious, I do, of course, have all the latest Windows 10 updates installed. Spectre Meltdown patches are running. You can disable them, and it does give you a small speed boost, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. Let me show you a different piece of footage. This is jumping ahead to when I had sniped everybody I could reach from the roof. I take off in the helicopter from the same spot. I'm circling around here. And of course, the frame rate when you're just looking into water obviously spikes. But you can see the real-time frame rate up there not move dramatically because we're far enough into the recording at this point that single jumps up and down in frame rate don't move the average by very much. We used our rockets to kill those guys. Oh, bad tech. Killed a civilian. Let's not drive into the water, shall we? So we'll hop out of our helicopter, and now you'll see us on the ground with the grass. And this is the part where I went in and killed the rest of the enemies and assaulted the entire base from land. I actually never came back to the helicopter. I went and I picked up a different helicopter. Forgot to go get the money. I went and picked up a different helicopter from the base and carried on with missions. So that poor helicopter is probably still sitting there, rusting in the ocean water or the ocean breeze and spray as it comes up next to it. But hey, thankfully it's not my helicopter. So with 23 minutes of play in this configuration, that is actually less expensive than putting a 2080 Ti into an old computer, which, okay, granted, you shouldn't do that anyway. You should get a $200 to $400 graphics card for your old computer, which is what makes sense. But hypothetically, just to show you the point, what was the average 1% low and 0.1% low after 23 minutes of gameplay versus our 10-year-old machine at 4.5 gigahertz and the fastest graphics card in the world? 103 frames per second average, 77 frames per second 1% low, and 67.1% low. A slower graphics card and a decidedly mid-range CPU at this point that's been available for under $150 at times over the past few months. With DDR4 3000 CL16 RAM, nothing special about that. Absolutely beats the best of the best from 10 years ago. Now, to be sure, if you've gotten 10 years of use out of your old CPU, then the value for the money is tremendous given the longevity. But it also demonstrates why, if you want to keep playing new games and you want to keep updating your graphics card, continuing to put new components into old machines at some point makes no sense. I am not making this to say that you have to upgrade to a Ryzen to enjoy old games. What I am saying is that there comes a point at where if you want to keep getting better graphics cards, better SSDs, better whatever, nice monitors, cut your losses and upgrade your whole system. Continuing to use an old system does hold everything back, and here we have a slower graphics card demolishing a faster graphics card because of the CPU difference. And we're not using Zen 2. We're using Zen Plus, the 2700X. This would be an even larger difference if it were Zen 2. Thank you all so much for watching this larger extended video, which ran longer than I really meant it to be. I thought, well, this will just be a quick 10-minute video, and here we are going to be at 20 minutes, partly because at the last minute I put the bonus footage in, which I actually have for a different project, but I thought, well, this might apply and be interesting. You know what to do. Like the video, subscribe, comment down below. Let me know what you thought. Links to the full playlist on this build in the video description below. This footage on the 2700X and this Ryzen 5 3600X here, you'll see these again in a future video. I'm just showing you another snippet from this. Interestingly enough, this also goes to show that it really does matter what you're doing in the game, because this particular battle that I recorded here on a 3600X actually benchmarked slower than the 2700X because of the engagements that I was in. So do keep in mind that if live gameplay is not tested in the same areas, which this footage you're watching here was not, then it's not going to be directly comparable. It is challenging to do live gameplay, but I do think it's a much, much better test. Okay, I've talked nearly long enough. Thank you all so much for watching. I will see all of you in the next video.